All right, today we're at Mount Vernon. So this is George Washington's estate where he grew up and where he lived and died after he became president. So we're gonna be here visiting, seeing what's here.
The first place we stopped was the Ford Orientation Center. We were able to pick up a map and our audio tour with the devices. Since we had a little bit of time before our mansion tour was going to start, we checked out the gardens. After walking through the gardens, we made our way to the place where we had to meet our tour guide. On the map, you can see that that's labeled Point A. There were about 6 other people on our tour. We walked through the mansion, and our tour guide did a great job explaining all the different parts of the house and the history of it, from the brightly painted rooms to the artwork and the furniture, the harpsichord played by Washington's granddaughter. In the office was a really interesting chair that had a foot-operated fan. The kitchen was detached, and apparently Washington had guests nearly every day for dinner.
And never knowing how many people were going to show up for dinner. There's a letter that George Washington wrote in which he said, he wrote it in the morning to his mother and said, if nothing changes between now and dinner time, it'll be the first time in 20 years we've had dinner alone. But it's early in the day.
Behind the home is a beautiful view of the Potomac River. After our 30-minute mansion tour, we exited the house and we were able to continue on exploring the rest of the property. So the first thing we did was we followed the audio tour to see some of the outbuildings, like the storehouse, the clerk's quarters, the smokehouse, the wash house, and even the coach house, which included some of Washington's vehicles. From there, we continued on and walked through more gardens, trees, and orchards, and vegetable gardens, and there was even sheep grazing in one of the fields. From the gardens, we went to see the old tomb, which was down kind of near the river, and that is where some of Washington's family members had been previously buried before he died. And then when he passed away in 1799, he was buried there as well. But that tomb was already in disrepair, and so in his will, he left instructions and designs for a new tomb to be built. Now, Martha Washington also was buried a few years later in that old tomb, but the new tomb started to be built, but it took 31 years before it was finally completed. And in 1831, all of those family members, as well as George Washington and Martha Washington, were moved to the new tomb vault. At the new tomb, there are many volunteers there working that could answer questions about Mount Vernon and about the tombs and about George Washington, of course, himself. And you can see both where George Washington and Martha Washington are buried, as well as some of the other family members nearby. The next part of touring Mount Vernon was a little harder to see, and that was where they have found burial grounds of many of the enslaved people. Now, they actually don't even know how many people are buried there, and they have archaeologists that are trying to very respectfully survey that land and see what they can find and where burial grounds may be, how large the area is without actually digging or doing any excavation. So it's all being done through technology, and they are marking where they find burial sites. There is a larger memorial that is sort of like a group memorial, but it is quite the dichotomy from just coming from this big, beautiful brick building where Washington is buried to these unmarked places just in the forest that, though they all had families, there's no names listed, and we won't know necessarily who is buried there, but just that there are those buried there. And it was kind of sobering for all of us and the kids to see that firsthand. Next, we went down to the farm area, and there they have demonstrations of different trades of the time and techniques that they would use for different things, but kind of the star of the show down there is the barn. It's a reconstruction of what was called a 16-sided barn that Washington himself, in his farming ingenuity, designed as a way to protect the wheat, keep more of it safe and clean from rain and weather, as well as from thieves. And they put on demonstrations of how that barn was used with the horses in order to kind of get the wheat down to the lower level. And you can see the horses and see that demonstration, and it's really fun. Down in the farm, they also have a recreation of living quarters for enslaved people and people there to tell you what a day in the life might look like, how husbands and wives and children would be separated, and maybe the women would be working and living in one area of the farm, and the men would be living and working in a different area of the farm, and they may only see each other once a week or once every couple of weeks. And what would a day look like? Long hours, waking up early, staying up late, and just working nonstop all day long. And they're there to share with you what the realities of that life would have looked like. Finally, we made our way from the farm area back up to kind of the main house area, and we saw the big, huge green lawn in the front, kind of the bowling green in the front of the house, which is where, at the time, visitors would have come in from that direction. And of course, Washington made it this sort of like grand entrance as they come in from the forest, and it's like a big reveal of the grand house in the back. At the end of our time there, we stopped by some of the buildings that we had skipped over at the beginning of the day when we were trying to get to our tour. And those included some more of kind of the workshop areas that were up near the house, where enslaved people that worked more closely with the house, like the blacksmith and the salt house and the spinning house, that's where they would have lived and worked. And so you're able to tour inside some of those rooms and buildings. After spending several hours touring the house and all of the grounds, the last thing we did was to visit the museum. We spent about 45 minutes in there, and it just gave a better overview of the life of George Washington, kind of a chronological life of Washington, and that was great. And after that was over, it was about lunchtime for us, and so we packed it up there, got in the car, and drove to our next destination. After a 45-minute drive from Mount Vernon, we arrived at Great Falls Park. Great Falls Park is part of the National Park Service, so there's typically a $20 entry fee per car, but with a National Park Pass like America the Beautiful, you can get free entry. When we were there, the visitor center was closed due to COVID, so we weren't able to do the Junior Ranger program or anything like that. We still had a great time though. After spending several days touring the city, as well as then spending the whole morning at Mount Vernon, we were ready to get back out into nature and do a little bit of exploring and hiking. So there are several main overlooks that look out onto the Potomac River, where it narrows and creates these rapids and falls.
Is this an actual river?
So this is the Potomac River where it kind of comes together and becomes more powerful. So it narrows. So the Potomac River is very, very wide and it narrows down. See how narrow it gets? And so that same volume of water has to travel in a much smaller area so it goes faster.
We only spent about maybe 2 hours there because we knew we had to drive back to our campground and we'd already had a bit of a long day. So we just spent a couple of hours at Great Falls Park, but it is a great place close to the city to just get back out into nature, see the river, see the falls, have a picnic, stretch your legs, and it's a great national park site not too far away.